Um, I'm Casey Vance, Executive Director at Ames History Museum, and I want to welcome you all to our lecture series program tonight. Thanks for joining, and we're glad to have everybody at our last lecture of the 2021 lecture series season. I'm going to go ahead and put a poll up on the screen now, and if you would, please indicate how many people are watching with you today on your device. That really helps us out to get a more accurate count of attendees, so thanks for participating in that. And there's also a question tonight again about how you'd like to see future programming, whether in person, mostly virtual on Zoom, or a hybrid. And once you complete those polls, we'd also love it if you'd be willing to type into the chat with where you're watching from. We're especially interested if you're watching from somewhere other than Ames. It's been really fun to see this year, since we're online for the lecture series, how wide-reaching geographically it has been. And then just a couple other housekeeping things. This program is being recorded. So if you need to leave early or if you lose connection, no worries. You'll get the recording emailed to you probably in the next day. And if you have questions for our speaker during the lecture, I encourage you to use the Q&A box, and you can also use the chat box. And we'll be monitoring those questions throughout the lecture, and Gloria will have some time at the end to answer them. And finally, I want to recognize our annual lecture series partner, Ames Public Library. We're so happy to have this great partnership, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to Kathy from the library.
Thank you, and I agree. We're excited about it too. We're always happy to partner with the History Museum, and we're offering this today in this virtual space rather than in our public auditorium. But I'm Kathy Cooney. I am an adult services librarian, and I just wanted to remind you that the library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas through diverse and inclusive resources and programs. And so we also have a page on our website that is dedicated to the history lectures, and you can also find the link to the YouTube recording of this lecture there, as well as a list of kind of recommended related reading. And I'll put a link to that in the chat here in just a minute. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Speck to introduce this evening's presenter.
We are very, very pleased to have Gloria giving our lecture tonight. Dr. Gloria Betcher is a teaching professor in the Department of English at Iowa State University. She has lived in Ames for 28 years, and she has embraced the city as her home, so much so that she has served on the city council for the past 8 years, representing the First Ward. Prior to that, she chaired the Ames Historic Preservation Commission for 7 years and worked on the nomination for downtown Ames to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places. A huge project, let me assure you. As a historic preservation consultant and avid genealogist, Gloria has come to know the city and its people as only an enthusiastic transplant can, without the burden of past association, family lore, and historic prejudices that all of us seem prone to when looking at places and people we've known for years. In 2014, for the city's sesquicentennial, Gloria and her husband, Professor Doug Biggs, wrote the book Ames, which was published in the Arcadia Press Images of America series. Gloria says I should remind you to buy your copy at the Ames History Museum. It features a wealth of photographs, and many that are not really very familiar or have been seen very often. Gloria is a medievalist by training with an MA and PhD from the University of Minnesota. Gloria is currently heading a team of researchers to produce a project for the Iowa State University Tracing Race Initiative. That project, focused on mapping the Black Iowa State College student housing experience up to 1940, draws on some of the research that she will share with you tonight. So without further ado, Gloria, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, Kathy. I'm going to try and share my screen. We'll see if I succeed in that. Does that look okay to everybody? All right. So before I dig into my expansive topic for this evening, I'd like to share a couple of things to keep in mind. First, when Kathy Speck asked me for a title for my talk tonight, I had to give her some idea of what I would cover. But I wasn't sure what I was going to find in my newly started research in census records, newspapers, and other documents relating to people of color in Ames. In retrospect, I realize that I've set you up to receive the 35,000-foot flyover view of a very complex topic. Please take what I say tonight as an overview, a framework into which you can insert your own research on diversity in Ames, should you wish to pursue the topic. Second, despite my best efforts, I've so far found very little information on non-Black people of color in Ames before 1950, other than local newspaper stories written in sometimes racist prose, the reminiscences of so-called old timers recounted by Gladys Meads in her 1955 book At the Skunk and the Squaw, and the work of Ames historian Farwell T. Brown, whose self-admittedly hobbyist and idiosyncratic research in Ames sources was never meant to be comprehensive and in-depth. Given the need to fulfill at least a part of the promise of my title, I'll include some of this information to add to the overall view of historic race relations here. Much of the talk, though, will focus on Black residents of the community whose lives are somewhat more fully evident in the official record, in research completed by others, and in oral histories of the Black families of Ames. Finally, I acknowledge that my perspective is that of a white historian whose specialty is historic preservation, not the history of race. Many of the sources I've just mentioned look at the topic of Ames' racial history through a white lens and don't represent the perspective of a person of color. When possible tonight, I'll let the people of color from Ames speak for themselves by quoting from letters, oral histories, and newspaper opinion pieces written by them. In the time I have available, I'll try to raise some thorny issues that require a much longer presentation on multiple topics to cover in detail. I'll do my best to identify those disputed or problematic issues so that they may be pursued further in any future talks that the Ames History Museum might wish to sponsor. In the last 15 years or so, the city of Ames and Iowa State University have worked to create a more unified one community. And that's the one community of my title. We've purposefully striven with moderate success to accomplish this goal, but the construction of one community where everyone feels valued and able to contribute fully is a slow, deliberate building project that has no end in sight. Looking backward, however, we can see how far we've come on building on the foundations, sometimes strong, sometimes weak, laid by our forebears since the white folks first began to alter the land of the Iowa tribe with farms, roads, and railways. Earliest times in central Iowa might best be represented by the indigenous tribes that called this area home. The following land acknowledgement, adapted from that of Iowa State University, is a nod to that ancient past, when the land on which Ames sits today was home to the Iowa people. Iowa State University and the city of Ames are located on the ancestral lands and territory of the Bokoche, or Iowa Nation. The United States obtained the land from the Musquaki and Sauk nations in the Treaty of 1842. I wish to recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, as well as to the 17,000 Native people who live in Iowa today. As many of you know, Native lands were ceded by treaty to the US government in the early 19th century. This governmental taking of land is one of the complex and thorny issues I mentioned earlier. Traditional white narratives and tribal narratives differ greatly regarding these treaties, their fairness, and the damage that they did. During our short time together tonight, I won't be exploring that history other than to note that the lands did change hands during this early period. Through the Treaty of 1838, the Iowa were forced off the last of their ancestral lands in central and eastern Iowa by the US government. Later, through the Sac and Fox Treaty of 1842, the Sauk and Musquaki were forced off their land in Iowa, west of the Mississippi River and north of the Missouri border by the US government. By 1845, the Sauk and Musquaki had formally lost all lands and were removed to a reservation in east central Kansas, although some persevered and chose to stay in Iowa. Some Musquaki remained in central Iowa, and the tribe eventually returned after the purchase of the Musquaki settlement in Tama County in 1857. The purchase of the first 80 acres of settlement lands was facilitated by an act of the Iowa legislature. On July 15th, 1856, Iowa's 5th General Assembly passed an act allowing certain Indians to reside within the state, which specifically allowed members of the portions of the Sac and Fox tribe, that is, the Musquaki, already residing in Tama County, to remain there. Those first 80 acres have grown to over 3,000 acres in the Musquaki settlement today. This land, owned by the Musquaki Nation, the Sac and Fox tribe of the Mississippi and Iowa, has never been reservation land. The settlement was purchased privately by the tribe and is owned by them, a rare, if not unique, situation in the 19th century. By 1848, white settlers had started to arrive in the area now called Story County. By 1852, 214 people had already started to lay down roots, and in 1853, not long before the Musquaki purchased their settlement lands in Tama County, Story County was named. Ames was incorporated in 1864, and the opening of the East-West Railway line on April 16, 1865, ensured the stability and growth of the community we know today. This 1875 bird's eye view of Ames, looking northwest, taken from the Andreas Atlas, is one of the earliest views of the town. Visits by the Musquaki to Ames were not uncommon, but prairie, streams, and bogs between the Musquaki settlement and Ames made the trip much more challenging and slower than today, though members of the Musquaki tribe who lived in traditional wickiups traveled light and no doubt had an easier time making the trip than the white settlers with their horses, oxen, families, and Conestoga wagons full of household goods. Even in 1870, when Fred Tilden and his brother Julius arrived in Ames with a wagon load of household items, the trip from Nevada had taken a half a day. And you could see on that, whoops, sorry about that. You can see on this map where the Musquaki settlement is to the east and a star there where roughly where Ames is today. According to Gladys Mead's 1955 book, Ames old-timers who had helped to establish the town in the 1860s later reported that members of the tribes often camped along the Skunk River in the fall with timber and game readily available. Historian Donald Wanatee, speaking to Farwell Brown in an interview, confirmed that the Musquaki migrated from their settlement to Ames in the late fall when their fields were dormant and stayed near the Skunk River where they could hunt and catch fish until spring. Wanatee also confirmed the old-timers' accounts of the interaction between the Musquaki and the settlers. Tribal members teaching white boys how to shoot with bows, teaching settlers the basics of their language, and showing women how to weave and string beads were realistic. You could see an example of the beadwork done by the Musquaki in this photo, circa 1903 to 1908, of two young Musquaki girls. The fact that members of the local tribe spent time in and around Ames is confirmed by articles from the Ames Intelligencer of May 19, 1877. In that edition of the newspaper, residents read that for 2 weeks, quite a large party of Indians had been encamped within a mile or so of the city. It's unclear what constituted a large party in 1877 when Ames had only 820 residents recorded in the census of 1873, but the presence of these visitors was newsworthy. The reporter highlighted the sudden popularity of archery among Ames boys, noting that the skill of the pale-faced youths was greatly surpassed by that of the visiting Musquaki boys, who were skilled at hitting pennies across the streets. Even more newsworthy was the sudden and inopportune birth of twin boys to one of the Musquaki women near a street corner on the south side of Onondaga, which is now Main Street. You can read more of the accounts of early interaction with these indigenous residents in Farwell Brown's first book, Ames, The Early Years in Word and Picture, Book 1, From Marsh to Modern City. The annual visits of the Musquaki tapered off in the early 20th century, perhaps because of the increasing urban development occurring in central Iowa and in Ames specifically, but the impact of the cultural interaction was long lasting. Ames resident Galen Tilden, speaking with nostalgia to the Kiwanis Club in 1943, lauded the way in which the Musquaki visitors to Ames provided an understanding of nature to their white neighbors. Ames boys, Tilden said, were acquainted with the birds, the flowers, and a variety of animals. Those were the days when nature had a real chance. This bucolic picture of whites and indigenous people coexisting in harmony, echoed in the work of Meads and Brown, provides a sense of the best of cross-cultural cooperation in Ames' early years. But the early accounts of Meads and local newspapers, not surprisingly, ignore the troubling way in which whites acquired land in the first place, and those need to be re-examined and placed within the context of what we now understand about federal policies governing the handling of indigenous people and native land. I hope someone with greater knowledge of Musquaki history will explore this topic in a more nuanced way than I'm doing tonight. More troubling, though, also not surprising, are some of the interactions of Ames community members with their neighbors of color in the early 20th century. Alongside the many positive aspects of race relations evident in historical sources, acts of harassment, disregard, and blatant racism peppered the pages of local newspapers once residents of color became established in the community. The remainder of my talk comprises a discussion of the treatment of people of color living in Ames, the circumstances of life for those residents given this treatment, and the ways in which the white residents of the community variously prove themselves ahead of their time and sadly no better than the worst of their contemporaries. Our best estimate of the number and demographic characteristics of residents in Story County before 1950 are the data from the US and state censuses. I say estimate because, like all census counts, these early enumerations are inaccurate. Even today, the US Census Bureau considers communities of color hard to count populations. Historical census data are flawed, but they are the best data we have, and they do provide a reasonable sense of Story County's demographics. The county had few residents of color in the years through 1910 depicted on this slide. The 1910 US Census, as the census still does, enumerated residents by racial categories. As you can see in the slide, the racial categories of the time were white, Negro, Indian, meaning American Indian, Chinese, Japanese, or other, which at the time was likely to include primarily residents from Korea, the Philippine Islands, and the Indian subcontinent, the so-called Asian Indians. As the Pew Research Center explains in its 2020 overview of what census calls us, politics, scientific understanding of race, and social attitudes all contributed to changes in racial category names throughout the decades. And until the 1960 census, common practice was for census enumerators to determine the race of respondents. This practice, no doubt, led to the mislabeling of Ames' sole Chinese resident as one of 4 Negro residents of the county in the 1895 census. That Chinese resident was Heng Li, who moved to Ames in 1893 from Sioux City to set up a laundry business next to the Davis House Hotel on the east end of Onondaga Street. He first advertised his arrival on August 10th, 1893, as you can see on this slide. Just came from Sioux City, where I have worked for 9 years and guarantee first-class work in ladies' and gentlemen's clothes. Farwell Brown in Ames, The Early Years in Word and Picture, Book 1, mistakenly identified a man named Sam Ding, who owned a Chinese laundry on the west end of Main Street in the late 19-teens, as the first Chinese resident of the city, other than, quote, a single Chinese graduate student on the Iowa State campus, unquote. Not only was Mr. Ding not the first man from China to live in Ames, there had been many more than one Chinese student at Iowa State by the time Ding arrived in the late 19-teens. Unfortunately, Mr. Ding suffered harassment at the hands of his fellow Amesites and left town suddenly after 2 incidents in April 1919 when dye packets were secreted in bundles of shirts to sabotage his work. Ames had seen similar harassment of a Chinese resident 19 years earlier with similar results. Like Mr. Ding, Heng Li, the first Chinese resident of Ames, also likely felt unwelcome in Ames after being harassed by local young people. In February 1900, he and his business fell victim to what the Intelligencer characterized as pranks, perpetrated by a group led by a young man whose name appeared no fewer than 3 times in the news and court dockets of 1899 and 1900 for drunkenness, fighting, creating a public disturbance, and using obscene language. The Intelligencer of February 22nd, 1900 reported the harassment of Li in this backhanded way, which did not condemn the inappropriate actions of the perpetrators. Heng Li, our Chinese laundryman, don't believe in the open door policy to the full limit. Wednesday evening, Bert Johnson and several congenial associates invaded his place of business, upsetting lamp chimneys and playing pranks with the furniture in general. Heng Li brought his artillery into action and found it an easy matter to disperse the crowd. Several shots were fired, but no one was hurt. The Ames Times, reporting on the same incident, claimed that Li drew his gun because of a dispute over failure to pay a laundry bill. These incidents of harassment don't speak well of the acceptance of Asian community members in the early 1900s. And yet, in the years before Sam Ding's departure in 1919, Iowa State College had in fact opened its doors to many students of color from abroad, including more than one from China, the Philippine Islands, Chile, Argentina, Mexico, and elsewhere. To encourage friendship, respect, and understanding among men and women of all nationalities, Iowa State College gained approval for a chapter of the National Association of Cosmopolitan Clubs in 1908. The Cosmopolitan Club's motto, "Above all nations, humanity," expressed the efforts of the college to create a more inclusive environment where students, faculty, and staff could engage in productive cultural exchange with members from around the world. As this photo from the 1915 ISC bomb demonstrates, many who joined the club were students of color, including both international students and Walter Madison, who you can see back here in this photo, whose image appears on the new Ames History Museum banner mural. I'll come back to him shortly. In fact, I'm going to abandon the chronological approach here to try and give you a sense of the lives of Black people in Ames from 1890 to 1950. I'm going to do my best to provide dates as I move back and forth through the period so that you'll be able to get a sense of the persistence of some troubling attitudes while still grasping the progress that's been made. 2 years before Heng Lee set up his laundry business in 1893, the first known Black resident at Iowa State Agricultural College moved to Ames. Anyone who has looked at the history of Iowa State University likely knows that in 1891, the illustrious George Washington Carver arrived in Ames to begin his studies at IAC. Carver became the first Black graduate of the institution in 1894 and received his master's from IAC in 1896. The history of his relationship with the Budd family, his work with Professor Lewis Pamel, his employment at the college, and his subsequent visits to town after leaving to become a professor at Booker T. Washington's respected Tuskegee Institute are all well documented. So you'll have to forgive me for not rehearsing the details again tonight. Other Black residents of Ames, both student and non-student, who have received much less attention from researchers, deserve some focus tonight. Unfortunately, because a majority of the population schedules from the 1890 census were lost to fire, we'll likely never know for certain if George Carver was the first Black resident of Ames. But other evidence suggests that he was. After Carver, several other Black students attended Iowa State, notably P.C. Parks, who graduated in 1904 and later taught at Tuskegee and elsewhere, and Joseph L. Woods, who became the superintendent of the Old Soldiers' Home in Marshalltown after studying at Iowa State for a term. Evidence does suggest that Walter Garfield Madison, member of the Cosmopolitan Club, 1914 graduate of Iowa State College and head of an early Black family in Ames, was the first Black ISC student to put down roots here after he graduated. Madison came to Ames sometime between his graduation from Tuskegee in 1909 and his enumeration in the US Census on May 5th, 1910, as a laborer living at the campus home of Edgar Stanton. Born in Manor, Texas in 1888, Madison had left his parents and 8 brothers and sisters behind to seek higher education in engineering. First earning a diploma in steam engineering from Tuskegee, and then a bachelor's of science degree in mechanical engineering from Iowa State College. His marriage to Gussie Irene Askew occurred in Cook County, Illinois in 1917, and the two later moved into a house at 1204 3rd Street and had 4 sons, Walter Jr., Archie, Horace, and Ira. The Madisons became one of the leading families of color in Ames, with Walter operating a successful plumbing and heating company. Throughout his time in Ames, Walter was a strident voice for respectful and equitable treatment for his race. Like Archie and Nancy Martin, progenitors of the best-known Black family in Ames, who brought their family to Ames between 1913 and 1916 and housed many Black students in their home at 218 Lincoln Way, the Madisons opened their home to no fewer than 12 Black ISC students and also took in Black lodgers, other than students, between 1926 and 1941. Although certainly not the first Black family to reside in Ames, Archie and Nancy Martin are now well known locally for their concern for and support of Black students who, by unwritten rule, were not allowed to live on campus at the college until well into the 1940s. Officially, Black students were treated just like foreign students, many of whom were also not white, which administrators seemed to think was fair enough. In a letter dated June 17, 1910, then ISC President A.B. Storms assured civil rights activist and co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, W.E.B. Du Bois, that, quote, Negro students are entirely welcome in this institution, that is, Iowa State. They have no discourtesy whatever shown them by fellow students or others, unquote. He continued his letter saying that, quote, it is not always easy for a Negro student to find rooming and boarding accommodation, except where there are enough to room and board together, as is the case with the Filipinos and with students of other nationalities, unquote. Archie and Nancy, having been born into slavery in Georgia, knew what hardship meant. Family oral histories of their lives and the lives of their daughter, Nellie, and her husband, John Shipp, also indicate that the Martin and Shipp families understood all too well how important a supportive community was in creating success for Black students and other members of the local Black community. Indeed, the Black community didn't count on their white neighbors to come to their aid when times were tough. Awareness of the need for support of Black residents by Black residents no doubt spurred the formation of the Mutual Aid Club in March of 1918. The Ames Evening Times for March 15th, 1918 reported that the club had been formed by the colored ladies of the community, quote, to promote unity, culture, and mutual helpfulness, unquote. The president of the new club was Mrs. M.D. Ollie Lowry, and the secretary was Mrs. Myra McCracken Gator. Evidence indicates that support for Black families in need came largely from within the Black community long after the Martins' arrival in Ames. In spring 1936, when the white women of the Emanon Neighborhood Organization delivered a box of canned goods and clothing to assist the family of the recently deceased Al Martin, the club minutes tell us, quote, Mrs. Martin was very grateful and thankful because she said it was rather unusual for white people to take an interest in colored people, unquote. In a 1985 interview, Grantland Shipp recalled the story of how his parents, Nellie and John Shipp, who also housed Black students in their home, provided shoes for a shoeless Samuel Massey when he arrived in Ames in 1941 to complete a PhD in organic chemistry. Massey went to work on the Manhattan Project, had a noteworthy career spanning many top-notch research institutions, and became the first American professor at the US Naval Academy. But in the early 1940s, well into the middle of the 20th century, he was still not allowed to live on campus at ISC or to use the lab with white students. Some things hadn't changed since the days of George Washington Carver. The Martins, the Shipps, the Madisons, the Gators, and the Lowrys, among other Black families in Ames, helped to fill not only the need for Black student housing off campus, but also other basic needs. Indeed, according to Ann Shipp, daughter-in-law of Archie and Nancy's daughter, Nellie Martin Shipp, the Black families of Ames supported each other in good times and bad, right up until the early 1960s. Ensuring that Black ISC students succeeded and made members of their small Black community proud was essential in a primarily white town where anyone of color could come under scrutiny. Still, when interviewed by Ames historian Farwell Brown in 1985, 93-year-old Nellie Shipp recalled that once Black and white neighbors got to know each other, race became less important than shared experience, particularly the experience of poverty and hard times. When she moved to Maryland to live with her son Grantland, Nellie remembered her new Black friends there were astonished that her best friends were white people who had lived near her home at 118 Sherman, a large house with a piano purchased from Eschbach Music on the back porch. That house welcomed Black student lodgers and became a hub for family and friends. Of course, there was always someone who didn't want to live near a Black family. Even among members of the tightly knit neighborhood south of Lincoln Way, which Ames author Susan Ellen Toth once described as a tiny rundown section of Ames beyond the railroad tracks known sarcastically as Little Hollywood. Nellie Shipp, however, believed that many of her neighbors in this poor mixed neighborhood, quote, learned that colored people are just as good as whites, unquote. Her daughter-in-law, Anne, in a recent interview confirmed that the neighborhood's social activities, even into the late 1950s, were somewhat limited by the economic circumstances of the residents, but included going to each other's homes for card parties and picnics and enjoying the fruit trees in the Ship family's big back garden. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Just who were these other Black families that created such a supportive environment? And when did they arrive in town to begin building that support system that George Carver and young Walter Madison had to do without as students? Strictly speaking, the first Black families to arrive in Ames may have been the Gators and the Carters, who arrived before Nancy Martin, who had preceded the rest of her family, moving to town on her own in 1913 to work as a cook in the homes of white people and in Greek houses. In 1910, Edwin H. Gator and his wife, Myra, made their home here. The Gator house at 1125 Kellogg Avenue still stands in one of Ames' most established neighborhoods, not far from where the home of M.D. Lowry and his family once stood at 220 11th Street. When the Gators and Lowrys built their homes there, Nellie Shipp recalled, no one objected to having Blacks in the neighborhood. The Gators became well-known in the community. Edwin was a porter with the CNNW Railroad, owner of the Gator Shoe Shine Parlor, and a waiter at the Hotel Sheldon Munn. Myra Gator, formerly Myra McCracken, was well connected through her family to Black society circles in Des Moines and Minneapolis. She frequently appeared in the society columns of the Ames newspapers and the Iowa State Bystander, the Black newspaper based in Des Moines, as she traveled to see friends and family, hosted parties and events, and opened her home to visitors. On April 16, 1915, the Bystander reported that Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Gator gave a weekend party last Friday at their new modern home on Kellogg Avenue in honor of the students of the Iowa State College. Music, cards, and dancing were the interesting features of the event. More notably, the Gators opened their home for the Black community's memorial service for the fallen athlete Jack Trice in October 1923. Among other tributes at that somber event, M.D. Lowry read Trice's final letter. After the service, which included music, memorial speeches, and a report on the memorial service held at Iowa State, a collection was taken for Trice's widow and mother. The newspaper noted that every Negro in the city made a contribution toward the fund. In 1911, not long after the Gators' arrival in Ames, Edwin H. Carter, his wife Lee Juanita, and their daughter Juanita moved here from Des Moines. Lee, at age 23, had already been married in Missouri to a man named William Ewing, who seems to have been born to former enslaved residents of Sheridan County, Missouri. By 1915, the Carter family had moved to Ames, and by the 1920 census, Juanita Carter was enumerated as a widow, a housekeeper at the Tridelt House on Highland with a daughter named Juanita, now age 16. By 1925, Lee had married for a third time to a man of mixed race from Boone, Iowa, named Charles A. Anthony. Her daughter appears in the 1925 census as Anthony's stepdaughter, Juanita Ewing. By that time, Lee's daughter had completed 2 years at the Iowa State College. She may be familiar to some of you from her face on the new Ames History Museum banner mural. Willa Juanita Ewing, known as Juanita, was the first Black graduate of Ames High School in 1922 and is the first recorded woman of color to receive a degree from Iowa State College, a Bachelor's of Science in Botany in 1926, and later in 1935, a Master's of Science in Horticulture. During her undergraduate years in the 1920s, Juanita lived with her parents at the home they owned at 2928 Woodman, now Wood Street. The family made money during the Depression by renting the house on Wood Street to Black ISC students for several years after 1930, during which time the family moved into the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity house where Lee was a cook. Juanita's parents, Charles and Lee Anthony, were active members of the Ames branch of the NAACP once it was formed in 1927. And Lee wrote to Iowa's U.S. Senator L.J. Dickinson in 1935 to advocate for an anti-lynching bill in the U.S. Senate. Both Lee and Charles died young in their 50s, with the widower Charles lodging at 218 Lincoln Way, home of the Martin family, when he passed away in 1940. All of these families arrived before or at the start of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to northern states in 1916. The Black families of Ames, no doubt, were hoping to find better economic opportunities and fewer Jim Crow policies in this northern college town than in the southern states they had left. They may have been surprised to find that de facto segregation and overt racism existed despite the abolitionist sentiment that Farwell Brown noted among the Eastern founders of Ames. Bringing to light and fighting against racist attitudes and policies seems to have become a crusade for Walter Madison. All members of the small Black community in Ames in the early 20th century knew Walter, I'm sure. He was an eloquent, educated man who used his pen to highlight injustice by publishing opinion pieces in the Ames paper. In 1915, Madison published a rumination on the state of race relations in Ames and across the nation. His opinion piece, A Revised Uncle Tom's Cabin, appeared following the visit of Terry's big Uncle Tom's Cabin tent shows to the Ames Showgrounds on Duff on Tuesday, July 27th, 1915. This traveling extravaganza featured 2 bands, drum corps, 50 actors, dancers, specialty, and colored people. While this hardly sounds like high drama, Madison was struck by the fact that Uncle Tom's Cabin was the only play he had ever seen in Iowa, quote, in which a Negro took a conspicuous part, a part more than just in a background, unquote. Indeed, he continued, it is the only novel I have ever known to become popular in this country in which the theme was taken from the life and experience of the colored people. However, I question if Uncle Tom's Cabin is adequate for present day conditions. Oh, that we could have a revised Uncle Tom's Cabin that would show us the qualities and trials of the soul after 50 years of freedom, which the other shows so well after 250 years of slavery. Here, Madison catalogs the triumphs and the contributions of the Black race in endeavors throughout history and makes the following poignant assessment of the situation of Black Americans in 1915. The Negro has succeeded in every line of endeavor into which he has gained admission. We need respect, pure, simple respect. Not an abstract something unmerited, but due recognition of our status in the things that measure men. It is not fair that we should have our rights and privileges abridged to the extent of embarrassment and inconvenience. It is not fair that we frequently cannot rent a room in an ordinary hotel where just ordinary men happen to be. It is not just that we often cannot expect employment in a factory or industrial system, including government enterprises, where just ordinary men are employed. These are a few of the facts which the Negro of 1915 must face. This is a condition for which no one can be blamed except the people. True that some have been more active in maintaining it than others, but all seem more or less to tolerate it. Then we have only to look to the people for a change. In closing, Madison argues that individuals, not races, exhibit both good and bad characteristics, and that all races are made up of individuals of varying character. He finishes with a devout wish that he might see actualized the vision put forth in Israel Zangwill's 1908 play, The Melting Pot. The Celt and the Latin, the Slav and the Teuton, the Greek and the Syrian, the yellow and the black fused into one great harmony, the Republic of Men, the Kingdom of God. In this opinion piece, we can hear the pride the author takes in his race, the frustration he feels with the double standards and Jim Crow policies he experiences even in a northern state like Iowa, and the ultimate conundrum he sees in a problem both so easy and so hard to address because it simply requires that people speak out and not tolerate injustice. This was Ames in 1915 through the eyes of a Black person, a town full of residents, both white and Black, who either stood by and tolerated the acts of those who sought to keep the races apart, or who promulgated unjust acts at the expense of their neighbors of color. A town where a Black man had to ask for his due share of respect. Similar sentiments are voiced by another Black Ames resident, Moses Dixon Lowry, a few years later, in a letter to the editor of the Ames Daily Tribune and Evening Times that appeared on the front page of that paper on October 28th, 1919. Lowry makes clear that race relations in the community had turned for the worse in recent months. Much of what Lowry writes echoes Madison's sentiments in theme, if not in actual words and phrases. He too loves his community and believes it can do better for its Black members. Lowry, a tailor with a successful downtown business, and a wife, Ollie, who was president of the New Mutual Aid Club, had brought his family to Ames in 1916. His daughters, Louise and Martha Athena, had graduated from Ames High, following in the footsteps of Juanita Ewing. His standing within the Ames business community, like that of Walter Madison, allowed him to speak more freely about the injustices he encountered. Reacting to the release of Orville Emery, a white man, from police custody after he was caught in the act of harassing Irene Cozen, a Black woman, for the third time in a week, Lowry writes in part the following: "Sir, I wish to say a few words concerning conditions that exist in our beautiful little city of Ames today. I am a taxpayer here, and until a few months ago was proud to be a citizen of a city where all men were given equal rights, regardless of the color of his skin or the texture of his hair. I do not mean equal rights socially, for that we do not want. Many things have happened in the past few months that I am sorry to say have caused me to lose some of my civic pride. We have only a few Negro citizens, and they, without a single exception, are industrious, law-abiding, peace-loving ladies and gentlemen. The fair-minded white citizens of Ames would be astonished if they knew of the many slurs and insults heaped upon the Negro citizens almost daily. They are insulted in places of business, in streetcars, and on the streets. It is a common thing to hear insulting remarks directed at Negro ladies on the streetcars of Ames. A few weeks ago, some Negro students entered a downtown restaurant, and the manager met them at the door with this remark: "I tell you boys right now, I don't want your business." And this is the good old free state of Iowa. A few nights ago, a white man made insulting remarks to a Negro lady on the street as she was on her way home from work. This was not his first attempt. Consequently, the police had been notified and were on the scene. They saw the whole thing and arrested the man, then let him go. Since then, the man has been rearrested on a state warrant and again was let go without bonds. Is there one law in Iowa for the white citizens and another for the Negro? I am an American Negro, and I am proud to belong to a race which has made the greatest progress in little more than 50 years that has been made by any race in the same number of years in the history of the world. Working as we have against that old demon, prejudice. I love my race and intend to fight for its rights as long as there is a drop of blood in my body. M.D. Lowry. Lowry may also have had in mind the harassment of Sam Ding in the spring of that year, but he couldn't have known that within the next decade, the Ku Klux Klan would take hold in Iowa, even in Ames itself. In the 1920s, Iowa, like many other parts of the country, experienced a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, and their activity. According to Robert J. Nehmeyer's 1995 article, In the Full Light of Day, the Ku Klux Klan in 1920s Iowa, 1922 saw the establishment of the first klaverns in the state, with membership in over 100 of these local units, reaching approximately 40,000 by the height of popularity in 1925-26. The Ames KKK Klavern, identified as All-American Klan Number 8 of the realm of Iowa, was chartered on August 2nd, 1923. The names of charter members would have been recognized by the community at the time. Among them were Richard Hammer, a bookkeeper and 22-year-old grandson of Parley Sheldon, former mayor of Ames, Hammer's twin brother Donald, a student at ISC in 1921, Charles Dragoon, the proprietor of Dragoon Transfer, a longtime Main Street business, John H. Buchanan Jr., a professor of food chemistry at Iowa State, and Harold Kuzer, whose census records suggest was likely Harold L. Kuzer, an ISC grad in 1923, who went on to become the college's director of visual instruction services in 1925. These upstanding members of Ames society were typical of the Klan membership in the 1920s. According to Nehmeyer, historians believe that this second wave of KKK membership was an outpouring of white Protestant nationalism, concerned with improving the ability of the average person to impact the values of society and the actions of government. The new Klan members were socially and economically stable, civic-minded, usually from mainstream Protestant churches, and primarily concerned with local social problems rather than ethnic and racial issues. The KKK in Ames did its best to appeal to family values by putting on parades and events like the statewide conclave that made front page news in the Ames Daily Tribune and Ames Evening Times on Thursday, September 4th, 1924. The article below the masthead made the event sound like Independence Day. Parade will be staged tonight. Saunders talks. Public is invited to attend ceremonies at Maxwell Park. We'll have fireworks. Music provided. Des Moines and Marshalltown bands will be present. Optimistic estimates by the Kleagle of Story and Boone counties put the projected attendance anywhere from 2,000 to 20,000. Actual attendance was approximately 8,000, with between 300 and 400 robed Klansmen and Klanswomen marching in the parade. According to the next day's paper, which also reported that by far the majority of the cars clogging Ames streets were filled with people curious to see the demonstration and ceremonies of the much discussed order. This was still a huge number of people, given that Iowa State College in 1924 enrolled 8,019 students, and the city of Ames, without those students in 1925, had only 7,301 residents enumerated in the census. According to Nehmeyer, this new Klan upsurge in Iowa doesn't seem to have focused on ethnicity or race as a primary concern, yet a cross burning in Kearney, Iowa, just south of Ankeny, when a Black school teacher was hired in 1927, suggests that some Klan members still possess the values of the original Klan of the 19th century. It's not surprising, perhaps, that Black residents formed the Ames Afro-American Protective League, a chapter of the National Afro-American Protective League, and then in 1927, approached the NAACP about creating an Ames branch. It was Walter Madison who initiated the request for an Ames branch of the NAACP with a letter to the national organization on February 28, 1927. According to Jeremy J. Brigham and Robert Wright, Sr., Madison's letter called attention to the intractable nature of the discrimination in Ames, which seemed to have been getting worse. The NAACP approved an Ames branch that year, despite the city not having the requisite 50 members to charter a branch. By 1930, there were still at least 30 members, both whites and Blacks, attending NAACP meetings. On April 18th of that year, the Ames Daily Tribune-Times reported that Madison chaired a meeting at the public library to discuss race relations. By 1932, the membership in the Ames branch of the NAACP had dwindled to 14 or 15 members, and in February of 1938, the branch ceased to exist because it had lost so many members, either because they had died or moved out of town. Lee Anthony had died in 1937, soon to be followed in death by her husband Charles in 1940. After acquiring her MS degree in 1935, Juanita Ewing had left town to take up a position as the head of the biology department at Alabama State Teachers College, now Alabama State University. Walter G. Madison took a job as chief engineer at Fisk University in Nashville in 1938, which meant he divided his time between Iowa and Tennessee and was hardly in a position to remain active in the Ames branch of the NAACP. According to M.D. Lowry, one of Ames' Black leaders, writing to the NAACP national headquarters in 1939, even the favorably inclined clergy had left town, and only he, his wife, and one other person had an interest in meeting with the national representative of the organization. In Ames, those race relations that had been discussed by the NAACP in 1930 included anti-Black sentiment that emerged in the community in a number of ways from the early 1920s until the 1950s. Because time is short, I'll focus on a few illustrative incidents that characterize the racist attitudes present in the community. On February 1st, 1922, John Siagres, proprietor of the New London restaurant, denied service to a Black man wishing to dine at the restaurant. That Black man happened to be Walter G. Madison, who we've seen was an outspoken advocate for racial justice. Madison sued Siagres for $5,000 in damages, winning the case and being awarded $100 and the moral victory. Perhaps the bad publicity this action caused led to a drop in business for the restaurant. It was sold at sheriff's sale before the end of 1923. Newspaper content that we today would find blatantly racist was common in Ames, as in other parts of the US in the 1920s. While we might cringe at the full-page advertisement run in the Ames Daily Tribune and the Ames Evening Times on July 21st, 1924, presumably the white readers of the day would find only humor and see no irony or insult in the segment for W.G. Madison Plumbing, featuring a black-faced minstrel heading. The face of musician Wendell Woods Hall, you can see him here. The musical lines, cartoon musical lines there from the sheet of music, and the parody of song lyrics for the well-known hit song, Ain't Gonna Rain No More, sung by Wendell Woods Hall, would have all been familiar to most readers, since the song had topped the US charts for 6 weeks and was on them for 20. But the choice by the newspaper to place the minstrel face, one of 3 design options, you can see those here, on the only ad for a Black-owned business seems calculatedly racist at worst and in bad taste at best. When interviewed in 1985, Grantland Shipp highlighted 2 other aspects of racism in Ames that he had experienced himself as a boy in the 1930s and 40s, or had learned about in school from the fondly remembered white female teachers that he claimed had tremendous impact on him and his education. First, Shipp recalled the galling segregation of swimming times at Carr's pool. Most reminiscences about the pool and about Alpha and Emmett Carr, the owners who built the pool in 1926, cast the Carrs as great humanitarians concerned about the welfare of children. Grantland Shipp, however, recalled with vivid bitterness the way in which the man he called Pop Carr bowed to complaints by the Southerners that didn't want to swim in the same pool with blacks. To please these residents with segregationist beliefs, Pop Carr allowed Black children to swim only in the mornings during the 1930s and 1940s. Shipp also recalled the powerful lesson he learned from those memorable white teachers about restrictive covenants on property in Ames, and the way in which, even without de jure redlining of property to keep non-whites from moving into a neighborhood, restrictive racial covenants controlled property transfers. Shipp recalled with somewhat broad sweeping strokes that, quote, no Jews, no Blacks were allowed on the north side up around Beardshire School, unquote, because of restrictions written into some of the documents. Examples of these deed restrictions do exist, and I do know of some from development in the late 1920s and into the 1930s in what was then the north side of Ames. Covenants restricted purchase and use of land in Baird's Addition, roughly around Marston and 11th, and Murray's subdivision, the north side of Murray Drive between Grand and Northwestern. Goddard's Addition in the area of Franklin Avenue, Woodland, and Oakland Streets in West Ames was also platted with a deed restriction in place in 1939. The names on these documents of those who purchased land or platted the additions comprise a list of well-known and respected Iowa State College professors, medical doctors, and business people. The federal government in 1934 actually encouraged residents to place restrictive racial covenants on homes to protect properties from being redlined by insurance agencies. This discriminatory practice has impacted development patterns around the country, but the impact on Ames development has not yet been studied. More research needs to be done on restrictive racial covenants in Ames, which were made illegal by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Some residents watching this might be aware of restrictive racial covenants on their own property. And I would invite anyone who has one of these restrictive racial covenants on their property to get in touch with the Ames History Museum or with me to let us know where you live. We're trying to collect that information. Now, as my time winds down, let me close with a few final observations and some words from Walter Madison. The history of people of color in Ames and the challenges faced by them and their neighbors in creating foundations for one community are obviously too many and too complex to adequately cover in a short lecture like this one. I hope others will delve more deeply into the issues I've raised tonight. Ames has not done the best job possible at forging a united community, but our forebears' efforts were not entirely unsuccessful either. The work must continue. The fond memories of the Martin and Ship families, the love of community expressed by Moses Lowry and Walter Madison, and the success of so many of the young Black people who are educated in this community speak well of the efforts made. But as I prepared this talk, I couldn't help but be struck by how many observations made by early Black residents about race relations in this community still hold true today. I'd like to leave you with some of the words Walter Madison wrote for a People's Forum commentary in the Ames Daily Tribune and Evening Times on January 8th, 1927. This writer has lived in Ames for the last 18 years. From the first, Ames has not allowed itself to be classed with the ordinary small town, but its government has been actuated by high moral and civic ideal. Whether consciously or unconsciously, this city has set the pace in many ways. I have developed a feeling of genuine patriotism, which has caused me to share every public aspiration for good and to rejoice at every public achievement. The writer has spent the most valuable part and probably the most pleasant part of his life in this city. In a business way, he has come in contact with most of the people of this community. The few Negroes here have striven to play their part as useful and worthy citizens. We have been embarrassed, insulted, outraged, and are entitled to redress. The Negro is not entitled to this scourge. Ames should not be left in the shadow. America must be relieved. Quote, the laws of changeless justice bind oppressor and oppressed, and close in sin and suffering joined, they march to fate abreast. Unquote. Booker T. Washington, famous Atlanta address, signed W.G. Madison. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. That was wonderful research that I know a lot of that, you know, the Historical Society, the History Museum hasn't heard before. So that's great to have that. Could you, while we wait for some questions to come in, would you tell us a little bit more about your Tracing Race project that you're working on?
Well, I'll see if I can do that. The Digital Library at Iowa State is sponsoring a couple of projects in this round of Tracing Race projects that are supposed to highlight race relations at Iowa State University, illuminate the situation of race at the university or Iowa State College, and to help people better understand what race issues have arisen over the years. The project that I'm spearheading in partnership with the Ames History Museum is an Esri story map project that maps where the Black students at Iowa State College lived off campus because they weren't allowed to live on campus. And each of the locations will be associated with a biography of each student who lived there and any information that we might have on the properties themselves or the experience of living in that neighborhood. So some of this information about the Ship family at 118 Sherman and the environment in the Little Hollywood neighborhood is the sort of information that might be included in some of the stories that are mapped on that story map. And that map then will be placed in the displays of the Digital Library at Iowa State, and it can continue to grow as a project. We're doing mapping of the Black ISC student housing experience up to 1940. We have about 80 names so far of students that need to be mapped. And then we're hoping to do additional segments in the future, taking that mapping beyond 1940 through the 50s, the 60s, and into possibly into the 70s. But that's in the future.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions coming in here. Was it the college that brought most Black families to Ames, or were there other draws?
The impression that I get is that the college really, there's nothing that in the oral histories that we have or the written histories that we have that suggests that the college was the primary draw for the families. It is certainly a draw for the students because many of the Black students who arrive are coming to study at the place where George Washington Carver studied. And then some of those students, like Walter Madison, stay in the community. But as far as we can tell, or I can tell at least from the records that I've looked at, the college is less of a draw than perhaps the college town atmosphere, although even that is not spelled out. So it's one of those issues that I'd like to look into more, and I couldn't give you a definitive answer at this point. I suspect as we get further into the 1950s and 60s, there are more Black faculty members arriving, and then the motivations for coming to Ames change.
Do you know when Black students were finally allowed to live on campus? The person who asked this question had her father had a Black roommate in the dorms in 1954.
I've been discussing this with my husband, and we both think that it probably was 1946 or 47 after students start coming back from the war. There's been a shakeup. It seems like the opportune time to make that kind of policy change, but I don't have the evidence for that yet. It wasn't something that I looked at specifically for this talk. It is something that we are going to be looking at for the Tracing Race project in trying to determine the cutoff for when people had to live off campus versus being allowed easily to live on campus.
All right, that is all the questions that I see. Maybe we'll give people one more minute to submit questions. Kathy Speck, I saw in the chat box, said that she assumed the census would be helpful in IDing minority people. How frustrating that it wasn't.
It was actually, to some extent. It's problematic in that that 1890 census is not available, and then there are gaps. So we don't know who came to town and left in the 5 years between the federal census and the state census. And again, the enumerators might decide that someone of color is actually a Negro or a white. I didn't mention that, Mr. Heng Lee was identified as a Negro in one census, and then I think Sam Ding was identified as white in one census. So that policy of having the enumerators choose the race of the people they were enumerating was problematic. But it is possible to at least see what they thought the race of individuals was. So I have been using the censuses, scanning them, trying to identify Black residents, and there are interesting patterns emerging, especially the housing of other Black residents as lodgers within the homes of the more established Black residents of the community. And those lodgers are not always students. Some of them are housekeepers or maids, porters, the sort of blue collar jobs that you might come to town for, especially if you were coming from someplace like rural Iowa, where there wasn't a lot of employment except perhaps on the farm.
A couple more questions did come in here while you were talking. Do you know anything about Native Americans attending Iowa State, especially Musquaki students, if there were any attending ISC?
I haven't found any yet, but I have not looked into it as closely as I would like to. One of the challenges there is anyone who has used the bombs in the past may be aware that the photos are not of a quality that allow you to determine, first of all, with any clarity, what color a person's skin is. And so if you happen to have a name that is, let's say the name is John Taylor, which I believe I've seen the name Taylor associated with some of the Musquaki tribe. The name John Taylor would not necessarily indicate a race, and photos may not be any use. And so it's reliant on the description of the student to help you figure out whether that person was of Native American descent or not. And so it's not as easy as we might like it to be, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue looking. And I think, as I have been told in looking at the Black families and their histories, so much information is oral history that the best way to learn about who the Native students might have been would be to talk to their family members. And I have not traveled to Tama County to the Musquaki settlement. So that's a very long way of saying, I hope someone else chooses to look into this who knows more about the subject than I do and maybe has those kinds of contacts.
Let's see. Do you have any information on where the Black families in Ames went to church?
Well, we have asked some people. We were told by the Martin family at various points in interviews that their mother, Nancy, was an avid churchgoer at the Methodist Church, and the family went to the Methodist Church. I have also seen that Lee Anthony was a Baptist. Now, I don't know which church she would have gone to. That's Juanita Ewing's mother. I did see that Charles Anthony had no religious affiliation. But what we have learned from the interviews is that typically families would all attend the same church. So with the Martins and the Ships, that meant going to the Methodist Church. I know I've seen something about George Washington Carver possibly attending the Methodist Church up to the north of Ames that no longer exists. So my impression, there was a lot of outreach by the Methodists in the South. And so families that may have had connections to the Methodist Church or the Methodist outreach would have been more likely to attend the Methodist Church once they arrived here.
Did you find any references in your research to the showing of Birth of a Nation in Ames, and were there any protests?
I had to cut that. Birth of a Nation was, I think it premiered, Iowa got it late. It premiered in Des Moines on April 30th, and by May 4th, there were protests in Des Moines, and there was a cease and desist order given to the theater there to stop showing the film. That did not stop the dissemination of the film, and it was shown in Marshalltown and Boone, and people from Ames are noted in the little local color column as so-and-so traveled to Marshalltown to see Birth of a Nation. It did eventually make it to Ames. I think it was in November, maybe, for a one-day showing. And that would have been at the, oh boy, now my theater names are going out of my head here. Was there a Twin Theater?
Twin Star.
Twin Star, that's it. It was shown at the Twin Star for one night only. And then there was actually a contest for another set of showings at the Twin Star where people could compete by reading advertisements for Birth of a Nation that would be placed in the newspaper, and they could win there were 8 $1 tickets available for the showings at the Twin Star, and you had to find a misspelling in each ad and then send in the correctly spelled word to the paper in order to win a ticket for the showing. So they made a fun night and contest out of this. I have watched Birth of a Nation, and it's truly unfortunate that the movie had so many innovative film techniques, which have meant that it's been shown for decades as an example of silent movie making, because it really is an atrocious piece of misrepresentation and slander. So I don't like the film, and I really don't recommend it to anybody. But I haven't found anything about protests specifically in Ames. There was the bystander, if I recall correctly, covered the discontent down in Des Moines.
Someone said, I wonder how many crossed the color line during the Great Migration and if any of those lived in Ames.
I'm not sure what that means. Cross the color line. So I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Maybe that person can clarify that. There's one other question. What is known of the land on which Iowa State University sits and Native American history? Do we have any archaeological evidence of living sites or burial grounds? This person said, I ask because what was the Iowa 4-H Camping Center at Madrid has burial grounds. Though not directly an ISU property, 4-H as part of the Extension Service clearly has strong ISU ties.
You know, I wish David Gradwell were here to answer that question because he would know that right off the top of his head. We do have some Native American archaeological sites in Ames. I don't believe any of them are on the Iowa State campus. What I have to go on, and something that I was really kind of hoping to pursue, but you know, all of those years crammed into 1 hour's talk, and I didn't get to look at this as closely as I'd like. The book by Gladys Meads talks about the fact that there was a large campsite for what she calls Indians and Gypsies, where Friley Hall now stands, and that it was opposite what used to be called Indian Ridge and is now as in 1955, called Stanton Avenue. I would have liked to have looked into that some more to try and find out where that mythology came from, because I have, other than reading her book, I have never heard Stanton Avenue referred to as Indian Ridge. And of course, Gladys made up all sorts of etymologies for things that were traditional etymologies that don't necessarily indicate accuracy. So I think that there's a lot there that could be studied more, but again, it's one of those questions where I wish I had that expertise, but I would put it in the hands of people who know more about archaeology and let them give you a better answer.
The person who asked about the color line clarified, cross the color line means appearing and living as white, yet being a Black person. One of my Black supervisors in New York had a sister who left Louisiana to go to Chicago. She crossed the color line and lived as white. When her father died, she couldn't return to Louisiana because she would blow her cover.
Yes, and I've read stories about people passing for years. I I don't know. I didn't run across any of that in the research that I did. The closest thing to that I saw, which was not part of the Great Migration, but which was actually part of local evolution of one Black family, was Charles Anthony's family. Willa Ewing's stepfather came from Boone County. And when I looked at his family in Boone County, what I found interesting was that going back a couple of generations, I could tell that his mother was Black and that her parents were Black, and that his father was listed as white. And in the early census, I think it was maybe the 1870 census, Charles and his brother, and I think maybe there was already a sister then, were listed as mulatto because they had both Black and white blood. But by the time we get to the 1915 census, and again, you know, the people were not filling out the cards themselves. Charles is now Black and his siblings are listed as white. And so whoever was doing the enumerating decided, I suppose, that his siblings were white and wrote that down, and that he was darker and therefore he was Black. But it's possible that his siblings maybe decided to pass instead of acknowledging their whiteness, their Blackness. We did hear, or I heard in the interview with Nellie Shipp, a report that there were often advertisements in the Ames paper of people looking for domestic help that were advertising for colored girls must be fair. So there was a preference for the Blacks who didn't look Black, and that kind of, I suppose, snobbishness about fair skin was definitely part of the culture in Ames. But I don't know whether anybody was coming up from the South and crossing that color line.
All right, one last question. Most of the homes of Black families that you talked about were in the residential area of Ames, east of Grand. Is there a reason that none of these families lived closer to campus? And wouldn't that have been preferred for housing Black students if the houses were closer to campus?
Well, the Anthony's house was over on Wood Street, so that's just west of campus. The thing that many of the houses had in common was that they were in the cheaper portions of the community where the houses were smaller. Anne Shipp said in her recent interview with Ames History Museum that her family actually made a point of buying multiple properties around the Little Hollywood area that's south of Lincoln Way, because the properties were cheaper, and they made a mistake in not buying anything closer to the college because it would have exploded in value. The Gator family and the Lowry family didn't have close ties to the college, so it made more sense for them to be living north of downtown. I think what you find is that because the Black families were not closely tied to the college, the housing that they provided was where they lived, and that was closer to downtown where they were employed. There were a number of Black employees who lived at the fraternity houses or the sorority houses, like Willa Ewing's family moving into the Fiji house. I'm still not quite sure how that worked, but they are enumerated, all three of them, at the Fiji house in the 1925 census. despite the fact that they own the property on Wood Street, there's somebody else living there. And so I think the Black students were living where the Black families lived, and the Black families in this period were less connected to the college than later Black families who come to Ames or who are brought to Ames to work at the university after it becomes the university.
All right, I think that's all the questions that we have for tonight. Thanks again, Gloria, for a great program and all of your research on this. And thanks again for attending, everybody, tonight. This was our final lecture series program for this year, but please keep an eye out for other programs on our website calendar coming up. And we hope to see you at the museum, at the library, or online again soon. Have a great rest of your evening, everybody, and take care.
Thanks, everybody.